What does a citizen want? Well, a citizen, after all, wants accountability of law enforcement. Now, that's funny. We all sit there and we say, what we want is accountability. But you know, that's not what we want. What we want is, don't spy on me. Don't spy on me, and I want to know who you were spying on, or more importantly, I want to know that you were not spying on me. One of the reasons that I've seen among people when I talk to them about lawful intercept and do you feel nervous about this is very common attitude is, of course they should listen in on the bad guys. Corollary, I'm not a bad guy. They won't listen to me. And people don't understand how quickly one can go from good guy to bad guy status in the eyes of the law, even when you're completely innocent. So, finally, what everybody wants is security. Everybody does not want an interception system that has the property that the average high school student can also use it. And that's actually going to be an interesting thing here. Now, let me talk a little bit about security. As a security AD for a number of years, I lived this pain. And, you know, when are we going to have a secure internet? When human nature changes. That's when. Human nature is, it ain't going to happen to me, and why would anybody ever bother me? So whenever we're inventing technology, we always say to ourselves, well, we'll add the security later, because after all, nobody's breaking into it today. But of course, guess what? The bad guys don't attack non-deployed systems. A prerequisite for a bad guy to attack your system is for it to be deployed. And if you've deployed it widely, fixing it later is very, very hard. Thus, the mess we have today. Thus, the Nanog wireless network that, once again, is susceptible to being easily intercepted. If at the very beginning of 802.11 they said, let's come up with a scheme where there's a key negotiation with the access point and the wireless card, and we would do encryption, the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, blah, 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 you could make, you know, the wireless network actually secure at the link layer. But instead they said, well, we'll invent this sort of wimpy, non-deployable thing called wireless equivalent privacy, which, you know, they really didn't believe anybody would actually use that. And so we get crap. Now, the other piece of history I've seen is if you want a security design to be good and strong and pass the test of time, it has to be designed in the open. Because one of the things the internet has assured is there's no such thing as a closed design for long. You may design something in secret. You may make all the design documents secret. But eventually, particularly if it's a technology that's widely deployed, how it works in all its gory details is going to be available on the web. If you want to know how to get into your cell phone, and you know, there's a back door into most cell phones. And the way you learn what the code is you go to Google and you type in the manufacturer name, the model number of your phone, access code. And you will likely find it. So for example, on the Nokia, this is not a Nokia, but on the Nokia, you know, star 3001 pound, 12345 pound is one of those magic codes. You enter that, and among the things you can change and read out is the security code that you thought was securing your phone. And so there's no such thing as a closed design that stays that way for very long. So therefore, you want to design things in the open. Now, another issue about security is there's always a security versus convenience trade-off. You know, for many years, I was trying to convince myself that this trade-off didn't exist. That if you were designing a system and it had this trade-off as part of it, then you were getting something wrong. But time has told me that there really is a security convenience trade-off. Now guess what people want? Convenience. Law enforcement agencies consist of people. People want convenience. Remember that. Critical part of security is accountability. And finally, now one of the things I say about security in general is in order to be deployable, security must be cost-effective, easy to use, and incrementally deployable. Now for this talk, incrementally deployable necessarily doesn't play, but it has to be easy to use, because if it's not easy to use, among other things, it'll get misconfigured, and if the misconfiguration results in no security, you're hosed. Now, security is different from most other technologies we deal with in that if you screw up the config file for most systems that are technological systems, the net effect is it doesn't work. And when something doesn't work, you know about it pretty quickly. But when you have a security failure, it's very often the case the application works. if you were doing something that was encrypting all your traffic, and this actually happened to a colleague of mine who shall remain nameless because I wouldn't want to really embarrass him, a tried and true member of the security community, someone who should know better. We were doing at the IETF during one of the security meetings, we were sniffing the traffic on the wireless, and then we published all the passwords afterwards. We didn't publish the usernames or hosts, just the passwords, so that everybody who would see their password would know who they were. And this guy recognized one of his passwords up there, and he came to me after the session and he said, I don't understand how you got my password. I'm using an encrypted VPN tunnel back to my employer. Well, guess what? Somebody had misconfigured the config file at the employer so that none of those tunnels were encrypted anymore. No one knew, because everything still worked. You know, the data flowed, the applications ran, except instead of being encrypted, it was in the clear. Who would know if they didn't look? We looked, we saw. They later figured out it had been in this state for several months. So every employee and every password of every employee was potentially compromised, and they didn't know, yet they were using security technology. It wasn't like they were negligent, and it was like a simple config file error. And there you have it. Now, I said this before, law enforcement wants operational security, which means very few people know about the intercept, and those who do are being threatened. Like, you know, you tell anybody about this, and we're going to put you in a cell for a really, really long time. They want it to be cheap. They want to be able to do more intercepts. In fact, they want it to be available. I remember a certain law enforcement guy complaining to me a number of years ago because I said, you know, cell networks, this was back in the days when they were talking about CALIA, most cell networks deployed in this country were actually installed with wiretapping built in an easy-to-use fashion. And so I said, I'm surprised you're complaining about the New York City cell phone network. Excuse me, wasn't that deployed with all this wiretapping ability? He says, yes, but there weren't enough trunks. We can only listen in to like 30 conversations at once, and that's not enough. I actually asked them how many conversations they wanted to listen into, and they said all of them. Well, they wanted that capability. After all, what's that line from the President's Analyst? James Coburn, he's in the basement, and he says, I'm paranoid because I think everybody around me is spies. And then there's a great shootout scene where they all kill each other, and he's still alive, and he goes, it's wonderful. I'm not really paranoid. They really were all spies. And so, like, maybe everybody in New York City is a bad guy, right? So they want it to be available, and of course, they want it to be remotely implementable. They want to be able to sit from the comfort and convenience of their little cubicle in, you know, whatever headquarters, and be able to say, oh yes, let's type in the Google intercept search here, Jeff Schiller. Oh yes, okay, he's got these IP addresses. I'll click the intercept button, and bingo, you know, it all shows up someplace. And then, you know, maybe there's a button later that says refine your intercept, and they can put in keywords or something. Doing it remotely, obviously, is very easy. It has better operational security implications because presumably what an ISP does is they plug the big wire into the back of the big router, and then they don't worry about it anymore. So you have good operational security. You hopefully have no technical limits on availability, and you know, nobody's really looking over your shoulder, which is great in case you screw up and watch the wrong guy. You can easily just wipe those records out. Who's to know? Now, of course, as citizens, what we want are checks and balances. We want accountability, security, and all that other good stuff. And one of the problems with interception is loss of confidentiality is really very hard to prove. If I'm listening in on your communications and I learn something interesting about you as a result, and then I exploit that information, how do you know where you lost it? So a lot of times when we talk about, you know, information needing to be kept confidential by various parties that you do business with, never mind intercept, you know, it's so bogus, because how would a common person know that their credit card company, you know, let their details slip? In the heat of Surcam, remember the Surcam worm? An independent local exchange carrier, one of these little ILECs, which had, you know, some number of customers, got hit with Surcam on one of their PCs, and it emailed me an Excel spreadsheet with 10,000 client records in it. They were using Excel. Name, address, telephone number, credit card number, expiration date, mother's maiden name, and even that little 3-digit extra security code that's on the card. 10,000 of them delivered to my mailbox. Now, if I exploited one of those, how would they ever know that it was that ILEC that did it? So losing confidentiality is very hard to trace. Now, of course, what does a service provider want in the world? Service providers are businesses. Whenever I hear a business tell me, our mission is to develop the best damn blah, 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 I always say, bull. The mission of every business is to make money. Anything after that is a strategy to make money. So among other things, you want the protection from liability, and Rand's absolutely right. You do not want an outage. By the way, the law enforcement guys don't want an outage too. Because when there is an outage, it risks operational security, and it causes people like Rand to make you remember it forever. And it has all sorts of bad implications. So at least on that particular score, both the ISPs and law enforcement guys are in the same boat. And maybe your reputation is important to you. I was actually thinking people cared about their reputation when I wrote this slide, but I have my doubts at times. So what was Carnivore? I've mentioned it several times. I call it Internet Interception version 1. Now, I don't know with a capital K how Carnivore worked. But I can make some pretty educated guesses from what little information they disclose publicly, which is it's DSNF on steroids. Or more to the point, maybe it's actually stupider than DSNF. But it has some hooks in it, obviously, for looking at PPP and radius to figure out what IP address we should be intercepting, because they want to map an account name. So they want to look at the radius transaction and say, oh, here's Jeff Schiller coming online. He just got this IP address assigned to him, so now we're going to grab all the traffic for that IP address. And after they've narrowed it down to an IP address, it's just a big sniffer, you know, recording it in some format. It was not a cheap solution. Like I said, they went out there and would like design it for each intercept to look like all the other boxes on the rack and all that other good stuff. But it required minimal cooperation. It was the kind of thing that, you know, yeah, once you got the duplex right, on the port you plugged it into kind of thing, you could actually require not much more cooperation from the ISP. Importantly, the ISP does not necessarily need to know who it is that you're listening to. So it has no accountability. Now, let me tell you, the whole Carnivore thing left a really bad taste in my mouth, because everything they did ran just counter to what an upstanding organization should do. First of all, there was this issue of should there be a design review, a public design review. Well, they didn't want to have one, because after all, these guys come from a culture of secrecy, so it just rubbed them the wrong way. They didn't want to do that. And then they finally agreed to have a third party look at it, but then it turns out the third party they selected had all sorts of ties to the government, which they tried to hide from us, because when they published the actual document they got from the third party proposing to look at this, they had done redacting to remove information about some aspects of that proposal. Except they were idiots, and they used Adobe to do that. And I looked at it, and I was actually looking at this document, and it painted on my screen with all the redacted words there, and then it blacked them out. And I said, gee, that means the information's still there. So a little bit of, little Emacs, and we had the non-redacted portions. And the thing that really was disturbing was what they redacted was the ties between those supposedly independent reviewers and the government. That's what they redacted. And so I'm saying, this is just slime. Now, slime does not match with the word accountability. And in fact, when you talk to them about, how does anybody know what's going on here, where's the accountability? They say, well, we'll only do what the judge says after all, because what we all know. I actually had an FBI agent tell me that the FBI never, ever broke a law. And I said, really? What about J. Edgar Hoover and his dossiers and all that stuff? Oh, and I love this is a definitional issue. Remember I said earlier, when it works, it's their network, and when it's broken, it's my network. Well, when they're doing their job, they're the FBI, and when somebody's being bad, they're a rogue agent. This is what was it? Mission Impossible. The secretary shall disavow any knowledge of your action. Well, this is that. And this guy was deadly serious. He was not joking with me. He says, we never do anything wrong. And so this doesn't leave me with warm fuzzies, okay, that accountability is really there and that this thing's even competent, which is important. So, Now, let me say, by the way, if they wouldn't do third-party review of the Carnivore box, how do we know that 13-year-old Timmy with more time on his hands can't figure out how to get into the Carnivore box and read out everything that's in it? And the answer, of course, is we don't. So, there's a balancing act here. Should we use an open process to design these things? I think yes. Should we be accountable? Now, the problem is, where do you get the accountability on intercept? Who should be the accountable party? Now, I'm an ISP in the sense that I run the network at MIT, and actually legally I'm an ISP, and that has some, those of you who know the legal obligations of ISPs, I get to have those. So, for example, when somebody reports to us that a member of my community is exchanging child pornography over my network, I have a legal obligation to report them to the federal government, because there's a law that says an ISP must do that. By the way, if as an ISP you fail to do that, the person who originally complained to you can go directly to the government and get a $50,000 bounty because you were bad. And by the way, there's also a law that says I can't reveal any information about my students to the federal government. So I had these two laws. One says you dare not, and the other says you must. Laws don't have to be consistent. This is what lawyers are for. And afterwards, if anyone in the bar wants to know how I resolved that one, it's an interesting story. But, so I'm an ISP, but I also represent my students and my staff and the members of my community. So I, as an individual, would much rather have, if there's going to be an intercept order against a member of my community, that I get to see that order and I get to actually be in the data path and make sure that they get only what they're supposed to get. So I'm providing a certain level of accountability to them because I'm making sure they're only getting what they're asking for. But that's work. Now, it turns out, go on here. Here's the problem. I agonized, by the way, over this talk. All right? Up until now, I did the easy part. Here's where the hard part starts. You know, should we be doing intercepts? Now, you know, if you asked me to speak on this subject on September 10th of 2001, as many of you, I would be saying, no. You know, we don't need this, okay? You know, I was sort of like everybody else, the civil libertarian type, and you know, we were worried about the government. And then, of course, the world changed the next day. And there really are bad guys. And they really want to do us harm. And how do we reconcile that between making sure at the same time we don't give the government such power that, you know, privacy becomes a quaint ancient concept? And this is the problem. Now, I don't want to talk about politics today, because that's an conversation to go on at the bar forever. But I'm going to say, let's talk about technology. Can you do secure intercept? And what I mean by that is, can you design an interception system that doesn't have a side effect that Timmy can listen in to? And I thought about this problem, and I said, well, you know, if we wanted to limit it to the FBI, if we wanted to say, we want to create a system, and I'm going to ignore the international aspect of this, just talk about the United States for a minute. If we want to say, we want to create a system so that the FBI is the sole law enforcement agency that has the power to do an internet intercept, maybe we could design something that was secure. And, you know, there's protocol geeks among you, and certainly plenty that I know, who can come up with, you know, a certificate-based and public keys, and we exchange this and we do that, and we record a log record here, and we get all our keys managed just so, and we get it so right, so that only the FBI and an appropriately authorized agent of the FBI with a smart card and a Dallas little I button and all this other great technology can actually do the intercept. But the reality is, that's not what's being asked for. What's being asked for is lawful intercept, and one has to recognize that in the United States alone there are 19,000 law enforcement organizations. And they run the gamut of capabilities from some very sophisticated folks, though to be honest, I've yet to find them, to some really unsophisticated folks. And so you're going to have law enforcement organizations. You know what they're going to want? They're going to want a website that they go to and type in who they're interested in. Like I said before, the Google, let's go listen in. And they're not going to want it to be secure because the security is going to get in the way and it's going to be inconvenient. And so they're going to drive the technology in a direction, I predict, that's going to lead to a system that's going to be trivially compromisable by, just about any teenager with some internet savvy. And like many things, the security holes won't be found until it's widely deployed. That's my prediction. That's my fear. And of course, we do have to talk about what about foreign governments. Here in the United States, we like to think that our government's accountable, but there's plenty of other parts of the world. In fact, I've been told about countries that actually have a requirement for multiple simultaneous intercepts of not only customer data, but each other's data. And it needs to be compartmentalized because you don't want law enforcement agency A to know that law enforcement agency B is also doing an intercept, which might even be of law enforcement agency A's traffic. So how's that for an odd requirement? They don't even trust each other. Now, actually, I'll think about it. That's kind of cool because they can look at each other, but we'll leave that aside. Then there's the question of, will it be effective? If we design all this technology to do intercept on the internet, are we going to get anything other than the stupid bad guys? I mean, after all, it became widely known, okay? I mean, we hear that Al-Qaeda is using the internet to communicate. But there's a couple of interesting things about how they're doing that. For one thing, they probably know, like everybody else, that we don't have really great internet, interception technology. And so they take advantage of that. But guess what? They're not stupid. When they figure out that it's being intercepted right and left, they'll change their tactics. But one of the common things that they're doing is they're using steganography, which is the art of communicating secret information in plain sight. And that can range from the very technical aspects of steganography, which might involve hiding a message inside a JPEG image, to really low-tech approaches of steganography, which is when they transmit on the radio the audio tape that they just got from the number 2 guy at Al-Qaeda, who uses some very flowery language to describe all the horrible things he's going to do to us. And you figure, obviously there's hidden code words in there that have a meaning. That's steganography. And so the question is, does this really prevent them from taking advantage of the networks? All right, here's an example. The guy sends the audio tape. It's maybe 5 minutes long. Everybody knows there's probably keywords in there, and nobody knows what they mean. What the heck good does intercept do you if you can't figure out what on earth is being said? And so, one of my fears is, and this is by way of criticism that's been made of the U.S. government for a long time, and particularly of the intelligence community, that by using electronic methods are really clean. You kind of do them in your nice office. You can go out to the coffee pot and get a cup of coffee. You don't have to be on-the-ground intelligence. You don't have to recruit agents. And so one of my fears is if you overly depend on let's doing internet intercepts, maybe what happens is you stop doing the hard work of actually infiltrating the real bad guys. But this is not my field, so I'm not going to say that I'm the one to judge. It's just that I wonder if we could deploy a very hairy technology to intercept everything, and then it turns out all we get are teenagers and dope dealers, and not the real bad guys we'd really like to get. And so I'm going to end this talk by saying, I always want to put this on a slide, and don't ask me to pronounce the Latin. This stands for who watches the watchers, which is really another way of saying how do we get accountability in this. And with that, that's the end of my slide.